Whew. Hey guys, it's Matthew Blades and welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It. I'm winning ya because I needed today's podcast. As you guys may or may not know, I am right in the middle of the big old grief river, having just lost my mom and then my best friend within 60 days of each other. Life's a little complicated for me right now. I'm in a tough headspace from day to day. I mean, things are getting better, as you well know. If anybody's been through this grief journey before, you know it's not like that forever, but it does. It takes a little bit of time to sort out these feelings and, just figure out all of the what's next. And I'm super happy that we have this Julieanne Williams interview today for you on the podcast. She's the author of 3 books, including Head Above Water and her latest, which is called Griefquake. And this is a fantastic conversation because to me, it's not too heady. This is just good, real life, practical tools that all of us can use while we're going through the grief process. And so whether you're fresh in the grief like I am, or it's been a year or two and you're having a difficult time moving on, or perhaps it's been 25 years and you're just starting to unravel all the ways that not dealing with it then has impacted you up to this point, today's podcast is exactly for you. So lean in a little bit. And by the way, if you know somebody who's really going through it because they've just lost, and it doesn't always have to be somebody, right? Like grief can come after you lose a job, after you move. There can be any bunch of life changes, right? That would cause one to have to grieve. So this is a fantastic podcast for you, for them. So please share it with your friends. And thank you so much for being a part of our Learn from People Who Lived It community.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
Hello, my name is Julieanne Williams and I live in Central California.
Julianne, what story are you here to share today?
I want to talk about grief and mental health and how you can get through terrible situations in your life, such as I did surviving the suicide of my husband.
Who do you hope hears this then?
Anyone who is grieving any loss, because loss isn't just death, but we can apply the same principles. So anybody who is experiencing anything that's difficult and hard, where things aren't turning out the way they expected, I hope this gives them some comfort.
Me too. I'm swimming in the grief lake myself right now, and I'm sure that's going to come up on today's podcast. But welcome, I'm Matthew Blades, and Dr. David Lycan is here with us as well in the top right corner. Good afternoon, sir.
Hey, Matthew. It's a pleasure as always.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I know that you have a lot to say on this subject, and so I'm really happy that you're along for the ride. Julianne, this is a fascinating life that you have. At the age of 5, you have this life-altering heart surgery. That ends up becoming part of your story. You go and you decide you're going to be Mr. and Mrs. Smarty Pants and you excel in school. I'm paraphrasing. And she does. She goes to one of the schools that I dreamed of going and that I dream of all of my kids to attend, Cal Poly. It just seems like the coolest city in California is what it seems like. And then goes on to get her master's of public health at Fresno State. And I'm assuming where are you at this stage of your life? Where are you with your children right now? Are you kind of like me? Are they like in high school? What ages are they right now?
So my children are 26 and 22. So they are young adults.
They are young adults. As you mentioned on the onset here, you're here to talk about grief and mental health. There are 2 things that we could all use a lot more understanding on when it comes to this whole thing. And so where does your grief journey start?
Well, actually, interestingly enough, it's very hard to re-experience some of the things in my childhood around my illness, because we have grief over not being the same or normal like everybody else is. So I was born with a heart defect, and it really prevented me from doing a lot of the things that my friends could do physically. And so that put me in a different place sometimes. And I felt left out, and I had a scar on my chest and all these things that I really had to kind of come to grips with. Now that is something that I've integrated into my life. And it created a resilient me. And that's important because when I was 36, my husband took his life, and I had 2 small children who were 7 and 3. and he suffered from bipolar disorder.
Mm.
So, you know, you never really expect that someone will take their life, no matter what they say, no matter how many times they try. And I'm glad we have a psychiatrist here to talk a little bit about that. But in the end, you know, that really trajected me into a place that I could have never imagined.
Yeah, I really want to come to you right away, Dr. Dave, because bipolar is something that we're throwing around that word more than we ought to be, for sure. There's a lot of folks who say that about themselves, and they're simply not there. So, can you help us understand bipolar and why that might be a critical factor, and what she's dealing with here?
Right. The problem with bipolar is the depressions oftentimes don't respond to antidepressants. And oftentimes people that have bipolar or go on to develop bipolar start with depression before they ever have a manic episode. And sometimes even manic episodes don't look exactly like manic episodes. They can be mixed, they can be depressed and irritable. So the upswings, the classic pattern that people look for is gregarious, risk-taking, super outgoing, like there's no limits to what you can do. And in that span of time, you can rack up a lot of problems for yourself with impulsive decisions and things like that. But the lows are difficult to treat, and the lows are usually the more predominant part of the illness for many people. And so getting a handle on it can be hard. Even when somebody's doing well for a while, sometimes the moods can cycle through the medication. Sometimes I've certainly struggled with this with some of my patients before, where maybe you get the bipolar part under control, but then they miss the highs, and then they start tinkering with their medications and drawing back on it a little bit because they want to get that creativity and that energy back again. But it's like playing with fire. You can't just have a little bit of it, because it tends to get away from you really quickly, and then it takes weeks to get it back under control again. So it's a real tough illness to deal with.
Yeah. Why would somebody develop bipolar? Would that be genetic? Would that be some tragic event in their life? Like, what sets it off?
That's one of those psychiatric conditions that's truly a biological base to it. It tends to run in families, although some people get it spontaneously, even though they don't have a family history of it, or the family history might be vague. So maybe family members have a minor variant of it, nothing that landed them in the hospital, or, nothing that was so severe that it required them to go into treatment. But, if you kind of take a very careful history back, like mom was very moody, and we could never predict how she was going to react to things, so that might be a hint that there might be a little bipolar propensity running in the family. But sometimes they come up spontaneously too. I've seen it both ways. And usually it's in like late 20s where it develops.
Interesting. So I can see you shaking your head up and down to a lot of what he's saying here, Julianne. So that's the clinical version, if you will. What's the real life application here? What does this look like in real life for you?
So mental health is something that we're not open, and we don't talk about it because we have such a stigma. And so I can take that all into the real world. Everything Dr. Dave just said, what is it like when you have a husband who is bipolar? And I experienced so many of the things that Dr. Dave just mentioned. So sometimes I felt I was walking on eggshells. I'd be coming home from work. I'm like, I hope he's in a good mood today. And let me preface everything and say that my husband was a darling man. He was the most loving, caring person. He just had a mood disorder that he did fight for, many, many years. However, with that said, he also would get to these places of depression that were very, very deep and dark. And he did try to take his life more than one time. And 2 times I was able to intervene. And the 3rd time, obviously, he figured out how not to make that happen. When he was really depressed, he would take his medication and he would go to therapy. But I think I love what you said about missing that high, because that's really something that resonates with the experience that I think within my household. He would say, I'm taking my medication, I just don't feel normal.
Mm.
I don't feel this. I don't feel that. And I'd say, you actually feel like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
That is how life feels. And yes, you still feel a little nervous. You still feel a little anxious. Like we all have this spectrum of emotions that you're going to experience whether you're on medication or not, but the medication will help the other part. And so then he would decide, I'm feeling really good right now, and I think I'll just stop taking my medication.
Yeah.
And it caused just a cycle that would be very difficult to get a handle on. And then we get a handle on it. We'd have a couple good years where everything was under control. It's very hard, I know, to live with that disease. And I have nothing but compassion for the situation that he was in. But he was the absolute case study.
Well, let me complicate things even more. Many of the medications that are used to treat bipolar have side effects that are really annoying. They can make you very tired. They can kind of sap your energy. So the medications can have side effects. Occasionally, the antidepressants can make you feel flat. So, things that should bring you joy, you just like, right? So that's not depression. It's actually a side effect of the medication. So it really does become complicated, and you're trying to prevent mood cycling that can cause a lot of damage in a short period of time. So in a lot of ways, it becomes like trying to treat epilepsy, where you just want to prevent the seizures, and side effects and complications of the medication are secondary to preventing the seizures. But it's a hard sell to get somebody to stay on medications lifelong. It's not easy.
Gosh, and it's so hard because I love what you just said, Julianne. It's like, yeah, it's hard for us. It's hard for the people around him, but the war going on in his head was 50 times worse than anything, you and I were dealing with. And, that's the thing about at least my own experience with depression was, man, it felt like a different human being running the show. And I remember going through my journey with medicine to try to balance things out. And what you all said couldn't have been, further from the truth, or it couldn't have been more true, I think I should say, because like I would go back and talk to my doctor and I'd be like, I feel like I don't care about anything. I can't get up for anything. Nothing gets me down. I feel like completely flat. And, he put it to me beautifully one time. He was like, listen, you're pretty used to swinging from like a 2 to an 8. And we're just trying to get you to swim from a 4 to a 6. and I loved that analogy of, he was just like, we're trying to balance this up, because I think what you just said, Julianne, that's what made me think about that was, we're just trying to, this is how most people are. Most people just swing in the middle there somewhere. And it takes a special person to be swinging from a 1 to a 10 or 2 to an 8 or something like that. I want to ask you, after this whole experience takes place, and I want to segue us into actually talking about grief now and how we can cope with it more, because, man, I don't know, Dave, you might have an answer for this, but it seems like grief has many stages, and it feels like it has all these phases. And then what's super twisted about it is it feels like in some ways it's a circle, and you kind of find yourself coming back around to certain things for a little while. And so what was your experience with grief, Julianne? Because my God, you had it hard. You had 2 small children that you still had to keep going for. So walk us through your journey of grief, at least early on.
To Dr. Dave's point, sometimes with those highs, people can make a mess. And so my husband had made a big mess. We worked really hard, to save money and get our life started. We waited to have children, and he literally spent every dime we had. So the day he died, I didn't have enough money to pay for his funeral. So that's sort of where the grief journey started. And that was a big blow. So not only was I dealing with this nightmare and my kids' nightmare, but I financially was having a very difficult time figuring out how things were going. Like, how was I going to feed everybody? How was I going to make the house payment? So it was a very complicated time. And, I was very blessed. I am very blessed to have a family and friends and a network, because connection does help healing. We don't do that just by ourselves. And so really important in my grief journey is I've worked hard to stay connected to people.
Very important.
But the thing that grievers kind of forget, myself included, because there were times I'd be like, I'm so alone right now. I have a responsibility to make sure I stay connected. So I learned that early on, And I think that's because I have such a supportive family that they made it very natural and easy for me to do that. But I would say that was early on something that really helped me. I had 4 years that my life felt like I was never going to wake up from a nightmare.
Mm.
In that 4 years, my father-in-law also sued me for custody of my children, for part-time custody, because of a disagreement that we had. And we were probably both wrong, to be honest. I mean, we were both grieving. So grieving makes you do things that you normally wouldn't do. And so then these catastrophes happen in the middle. So we also had that, and taking my children to appoint a psychologist. They were holding my leg. Please don't take us away from our mommy. I mean, it was brutal. And so the grief just kind of kept coming. I did not see any light at the end of the tunnel for the first 5 years. And one thing that I would do different is I delayed working through my own grief because I was so stuck in, number one, all of the things like figuring out how to pay my bills and do all the day-to-day, like even my husband, I never took out the trash. I never washed my car. I never got gas. So I had to then learn also to integrate every single task into my day with my 2 little babies, pick them up, drop them off, homework. And then, it just was very overwhelming. What I realize now, though, is I should have taken the time and I got counseling, but to seriously work on my grief early, because I could have been a better help for my children.
Dave, I want you to speak to this. She talks about how everybody's in pain, everybody's hurting, everybody's grieving, and then that can cause more harm because hurt people hurt people. We've talked about that before on this podcast. And so do you have any suggestions, Dave, on, and we're living this right now twofold for me. My mom, as I mentioned, Julianne, my story may come up, and here we go. April 1st, we lost my mom very, very suddenly. She had a car accident, and we learned Alzheimer's, and within 3 weeks she was gone at only 73. And just 2 weeks ago today, my best friend died from complications of a cancer trial that he'd been fighting for a few years. What are some really good practices for folks who and families who are going through this situation right now to recognize about themselves?
The first thing that comes to mind is most people don't have opportunities to prepare for this ahead of time, right? So when somebody dies suddenly, you're in the middle of it and you're trying to figure it out. So it's not like you've had months to think about it and say, gee, if this happened, how would I handle it and what would I do? Kind of like war game it out in your mind ahead of time. So you're thrown right in the middle of the deep end of the pool with the responsibilities that you had prior to the loss, the responsibilities that you're picking up for the person who had passed that they're no longer available to do it. Plus other, when there are kids involved, making sure that they're okay. And so where do you have time to take care of yourself, right? So that's a very practical question and a practical consideration. And where do you have bandwidth to draw from to create that space that you need, right? One of the other things too is as you're grieving, your tolerance is low, right? So you're already stretched about as far as you can go. And then when other family members who are also grieving and also stretched start acting up in whatever ways and maybe playing out some childhood conflicts that never fully got resolved, but as adults you kind of keep it on the down low, and so all this stuff now bubbles up. It's hard to create the space that you need to allow that grieving. Now, with that said, now that we're having this conversation, and if there are people that are kind of latching on to this discussion and thinking, okay, well, I'm in this right now, I think being deliberate about it and maybe tapping into some of those resources with family and friends and say, hey, can you watch the kids for an afternoon? I just need to go for a drive, or I just need to get out of the house for a little bit, so you can use some of the resources that you have to kind of create that space. And sometimes even just having some quiet, having some time where you can just kind of be with your thoughts and kind of process through what you're dealing with can be really helpful.
Yeah. So how was it for you, Julianne? Because here's what I'm imagining with a 7 and a 3-year-old, like you could rationalize to yourself that they don't fully understand what's happening here. And for them, and this is maybe a lie that we tell ourselves as adults, but for them, you could say like, hey, we just need to keep them going, keep them busy, keep them in things, keep life moving the way that it was. And when something as massive as losing your husband the way that you did happens, like life just isn't going to be the same again. It is going to be different from this point forth. And to try to take that square peg and put it in the round hole again, it's simply not going to fit. And so I want to know from your vantage point, let's learn from you right now, Julianne, how did you navigate it then? And now that you had a chance to think about it and it's later on in the journey, what are some tweaks that you might have done differently?
So it's very interesting. So I only took 2 weeks off from work and went back to work. Now, I had a boss, the COO of my company. I mean, and I was lucky because I was in a high management position, which is different. You know, some people don't have that luxury where I had a lot of flexibility, and I had a boss that allowed me, and his name was Dave Devereaux, and he was so compassionate. So some days I went to work for an hour, and some days I went to work for 6 hours, and some days I didn't go to work. And he let me grieve while I was working. And that's not something everybody gets. So I also understand some of the blessings that I have had that make my situation a little unique. However, with that said, I went back to work fairly early, and I do think that's okay. It was okay for me. I have people, and when I have grief clients that say like, well, I went back to work after a week, and people were like, why are you back to work? What I can say after I've lived it is we all have that journey, and we have to decide when we have to have some sense of normalcy. So I think the balance is you have to determine when and how much of a sense of normalcy you need to feel in your life. And that's going to be so personal. If I look back, I think I still would have went back to work. I had my whole family and my mom and dad helping me with the kids and so on. So they and my children were used to being with them. So there were a lot of things that were actually still very the same, but there was obviously a very, very big piece missing. So I think in the end, if I was going to say, what would I do different? I think it would be more that I would have maybe slowed myself down a little bit more. Maybe I would have gone to work, but maybe I wouldn't have. But in the end, I wanted to get away from all the pictures and the environment that was reminding me of good and bad things. I probably should have sat in that a little bit.
As you were talking, I felt this urge to ask you a question, and it's fairly personal. So if you don't want to describe this, you don't have to. How did you explain to your children what had happened with your late husband?
So I will tell you that is probably the most difficult thing I have ever had to do.
I can't even imagine.
It's a situation that you can never anticipate. Right. Because he was having so many problems with his mental health he was hospitalized just right before he took his life, and they had changed his medications. And I'm sure Dr. Dave can talk about the risks of what that does with the bipolar disorder. There had been a lot of things that were happening in the months preceding it. Now, they were little, so they probably couldn't put that all together. However, what they knew is that there was something going on with their dad. And he had actually moved out for a couple of months and had then moved back home. So there was just a lot happening. However, being so little, you would think, like you said, that they don't get it. I just told them he was missing for 3 days. And it's interesting. This is the week after. Yesterday was the day that he passed away, the anniversary. So it was interesting that we ended up on this week, because I'll talk about that a little bit later if you want, about how it looks like 19 years later, because I think there's something interesting people need to know. With that said, with the children, my daughter they were sleeping in bed with me because they knew something was not right. My husband had been gone. I told them Daddy had a work trip. I was just trying, but my friends and family were over. One of my best friends stayed the night. It just, you could definitely tell there was something different. I walked upstairs, and I was told at 1:13 in the morning by the police. They came to my house, and so that I had a few hours to decide, first of all, what did I want to say? What did I want them to know? And I live in a small town, so I knew there was a big risk that at some point in their life, if I didn't tell them the truth, somebody would. So I had to make a determination. Did I want to be honest that he took his life? I walked up the stairs and I went into my room and my daughter was laying there, and I walked in and she woke up. And I looked at her and she's like, "You're sad." And I said, "Yes, I need to talk to you about Daddy." And she said, "He's dead." I was like, "What?" "I know, my daddy's dead." And, it was unbelievable, to be honest.
I mean, I'm almost coming to tears just thinking about that right now, how incredible that must have been.
Yeah. And I said, Daddy did, Daddy's not going to come home. He's in heaven. And then I had that same conversation with my 3-year-old, and he, it was actually a month from my daughter turning 8. And it was brutal. I mean, the grief, when you hear the sounds that come from people who are grieving, it can wreck you. And I was wrecked.
Julianne, did you tell the kids that he had taken his own life, or you just told them that he had passed?
So at first I told them that he had gone to heaven, because I didn't want to, I mean, they're little, right? You can only process so much.
Right.
So I'm glad I have a psychiatrist to give me some feedback. But I did. I just told them at first he had gone to heaven. And then before the funeral, I explained to them that he had been sick, and that the reason he had moved out is because his mind was sick, and that sometimes people who had minds that were sick made decisions that were not right. And that was one that he made.
I think one of the tricky balances, because I've seen situations where the families, in the obituary or even, when they have a memorial service, don't even mention suicide. They don't mention the cause of death at all. With kids, it's tricky because if they figure out that it was a suicide, the thing to be careful of is not that they think that they caused it in some way.
Yes.
And that's kid logic. There's nothing from an adult looking at it that would ever lead somebody to believe like, oh, the kids made him do this. But sometimes children, especially young children, they can't understand why somebody would want to leave them in such a way. And so they fill in the blanks with, well, I must have done something bad that, because you discipline your kids. So sometimes you have to, be negative with them to correct them. And like I said, kids can sometimes come to the wrong conclusion. So but at the same time, you don't want to traumatize them by telling them too much. And then they think about that then. So it's
Right.
a very tough balance to try to find, how much.
Right. I didn't tell them like, how did it happen?
Yeah.
To your point, right? But I think you made a really good point about just the whole thing about causation. Because I would venture to say, with my kids being 26 and 22, if you ask them and they really, if they were going to be real about it, I think they would still both say that they feel responsible in some way.
Interesting.
Like you said, kid logic. It doesn't compute, right? Those wirings were made at that young age, and it'll take years of therapy, who knows what else to kind of unwire that.
Right.
Julianne's here because she's gone through this unbelievable life experience. She's also put out 3 books, and the latest is called Griefquake. You can see it there on the left if you're watching our version on YouTube. Let's jump into some of the strategies that you write about in the book, and some of the things that are in there that might be helpful for us. I'm certainly going to be leaning into this conversation, as I'm, like I said, like right in the middle of grief lake right now, just trying to sort it out. And I think I'm using my tools and I'm doing the best job that I can, but potentially we've got more to learn from you today. So what is one of the chapters in the book that you really enjoy talking about because it was so poignant to your life?
I think importantly in both books, what I really want to share with people is that grief is hard and grief is unique. In our society, we don't want to talk about things that are difficult, and we don't want to share about things that make us vulnerable. And I was actually very private about many things. People knew that he had taken his life, but I was very, very private about many other things just because I tend to do that. So for me, this is a really big step out to write these books. And I remember when I released the first one, I was like, what did I just do? But with that said, I did it because to honor my husband and because no one should have to go through what my family has gone through. But if I think about what chapter, the most important thing to me is to understand that grief is unique, grief hurts, and it doesn't go away. And so that's why I said a day or so away from it being 19 years. And I had a terrible day a couple of days ago. I had a terrible day. And there's some years I've had that day and it's felt like no other day. This year, I had a terrible day. And I think if we can normalize the fact that we never stop loving the person, then we can also normalize the fact that it's okay that we're sad. Because it's like we want to do this thing that says, I have to heal this. I have to change this. These are all the expectations that I have to do. But in my mind, I just miss that person, or I miss that job that gave me so much reward, or that child left my house and never came back. There's so much that causes us grief. And so I think, with the book, I have a strategy called H.O.P.E. And what I say is H is heed, which is just stop. And that was something I said that if I was going to do it again, I would probably spend a little more time. Stop. Just stop and feel what you're feeling and let it go, because until you release it, it stays right with you and you won't heal. And so first, stop, identify what you're feeling in your body, what you're feeling in your mind, acknowledge it, name it, and then release it. But then also remember to take time. So that's the H. O is opportunity. And the reason I say opportunity is because, opportunity means that something's going to change, right? Well, in the end, if you think about grief, it will change. Your situation that you're in will change. It will get better. You will cry less. You will feel less dark. So if you always remember that today's another opportunity and the opportunity is there for things to get better, then you can realize that even if today, right this moment, you feel you're so dark and in so much pain, know that nothing lasts forever and it's going to change.
Can I interject something really quick? Because we have a mutual friend, Dr. Dave and I do, Jill McMahon, who is a grief specialist, and she is just an unbelievable human being. And when I've been going through all this stuff with my mom, my best friend, of course, I phoned my friend, Jill, community. And, I just was talking to her, and she said something really interesting that I'd never heard before, which she said, grief tends to evolve in 2-week increments. And so I just thought that was really interesting to learn, because when you're in the shit, when you're really in it, man, it feels like it's never going to go away. And you think you're going to be sad this way for the rest of your life. But hearing that every couple of weeks, this is going to shift, and kind of reminding myself of that and saying, okay, I'm allowed to have a hard couple of weeks here. It's only been 2 weeks since Quox died. Like I'm allowed to still be in my funk and in my head and in my heart. And I'm allowed to still be really sad about it, because in the next couple of weeks, that's going to shift a little bit. So I just wanted to put that out there really quick, because as I learned that, I just thought that was such I don't know what the word is, but it felt like good information. Do you know what I'm saying, David? Like it felt like good information for me.
I haven't observed the 2-week cycle, but for sure it does cycle. And I think one of the things that I've learned doing yoga and meditation and mindfulness is you don't necessarily have to react to everything that you're feeling and experiencing. You can just observe it and let it wash over you and let it do its thing, and then let it dissipate and let it move on. I think sometimes we get used to reacting to things, or if you're a hard-driven person and a problem solver, when something comes up that shouldn't be, you want to just fix it right away and get rid of it and move on to something else. Sometimes it's okay to just sit with it.
Okay. So let's get back to hope. We've got heed, we've got opportunity. What's the P stand for?
P is purpose. And I am a very faith-based person. And so I believe in the book of Ephesians, it talks about the fact that we are all put here for a reason, and that God prepared us in advance for everything we would experience. And so what that means is, number one, there's a reason that we're here, and we need to remember that there's still a reason we're here. The second thing is that God prepared us in advance. So we have the skills to get through even the hard times. And it's, for me, that is very important. And the reason I know I went back to work early is because work was my purpose. You know, I took care of the elderly. I worked in the nursing home business, and I loved what I did. So I had to get to a point, and that's why I did P with purpose, to remember that even though right now I feel terrible, I feel sad, I feel hopeless, I actually still have a purpose, and I just need to reconnect with what that is.
Such a great point, because that in itself, man, can almost pull you right out of the weeds. Just having something that's important to you. And I'm going to come to you, Dave, after she explains what E is, and ask you to kind of summarize HOPE from your point of view. So where are we at with the E now? Is this time to eat food? Are we eating?
No, I love eating, but E is actually that you actually have to do something about it.
Oh.
So you have to execute.
Okay.
And that's tough when you're grieving, because you don't want to, you want to feel like, I don't want to do anything. I just want everything to come to me. But in the end, the thing that I have learned is when I have made strides in my healing, and again, I go backwards, and that's what grief does. It is not like you just get to this point, you're like, okay, I'm no longer sad, I don't miss this person. But you are able to deal with it better each and every time. However, what I learned is that if I didn't do something, then nothing was going to happen, and I would stay exactly where I was. And so what did that mean? That meant going to church, reaching out to my family and my friends, going back to work, spending time with my children, whatever it was. I actually had to make that happen. And the more that I had a success with choosing to make something happen, the easier it became over time. So that's what we have to remember, is it's nothing just comes our way. We have to be a part and want to heal.
Boy, isn't that a powerful thing to hear, that you actually have to want to heal from it. And it can be so easy to sit in the sadness, because, I mean, it's a terrible thing to lose somebody, especially the way that you did, Julianne. So, Dave, give me your feedback on HOPE, and anything that you might add to it or enhance what she's talked about.
Well, there's a couple of things that came to mind. One is when you talk about the idea of execute, and then in the context of still having days where you're grieving and maybe feeling okay for a while, and then all of a sudden an anniversary or something reminds you, and it kind of takes you back again. It reminds me of, what I consider like the lighthouse principle, right? So if you're in a boat and you're trying to get from one point to another, and the lighthouse is where you're going to, that's the point that you're aiming for. If the winds kick up and blow you off course, once the winds stop, you can still find that lighthouse and then correct your course and start heading in that direction again, right? So it's not a matter of not having bad days, or not having setbacks, or not having a period where you're stuck for a little bit. But if you know where you're trying to end up, as soon as that cloud lifts, you can start the process of getting back on that track again. So that was one thing. Oh gosh, I kind of got derailed from something else I was thinking.
You're good. Heed, opportunity, purpose, and execute. Just to remind you of the four. Was there anything that pops back in now?
Well, there was another thing that had come up while you were talking, Julianne. The idea of rebuilding after such a devastating loss reminds me of the Japanese art of kintsugi, if you're familiar with that. So when a piece of pottery is broken, instead of throwing it out, they repair it with gold. They put the pieces back together with gold, and it ends up becoming a very beautiful piece at the end, where all the cracks are highlighted with gold, and it becomes a functional bowl again. So, the idea of healing is not that you get rid of the cracks, and not that you ever get over, like it, where people get stuck sometimes is they want things to go back the way it was before the trauma. And we're always on a one direction path. There's never any going back. So figuring out how to allow yourself to accept where you are right now, and then figure out what's a healthy path forward. That's, putting that gold inlay in there and trying to figure out how to knit everything back together so it's functional again.
Gosh, that's such a cool thing. I'd never heard that before, but I really love the sentiment of it. Getting back to your new book, Julianne, what are some other strategies that you write about that might be helpful for us as we're cycling through these moments after death?
Well, again, I talked about it earlier, and it really is getting professional help.
Yes.
Psychiatry, psychology, whatever it is that you need, it really is important if you have the resources to use them. And because there are so many ways now that therapists can work with you that fit with the way that you process information. And so I think it's really important to find a good practitioner. Dr. Day made me think of something as he was talking, which is, if I was going to think about, what some of my strategies, well, that coulda, woulda, shoulda part is one of the hardest parts of grief. You said the one-way path. And so sometimes also, you have to let yourself think about the way you thought it was going to be, and then decide that, that's not how it's going to be. And all the things that you thought, you can still dream about them, because you grieve that too. Right? I mean, it's like, you don't just grieve the loss, then you also grieve, like for me, when my daughter just got married, there was no father to walk her down the aisle. They graduate from high school, college, whatever. I re-grieve that. So, when I think of the book, what I really am trying to explain to people is that it's a straight path or a one-way path, but it's not a straight path. And also that you have to have, or I shouldn't say you have to have, allow yourself to have the confidence to know that everything you're feeling is okay, and that it will pass. It's an emotion. And Dr. Dave talked about that, not getting led around by your emotions. And I think I talked about that in one of the chapters, how I know part of the things that happened that were even more tragic in the end were all led by emotions. I encourage people not to make big decisions shortly after grief. I encourage people to surround themselves with people who are comfortable for them, to lean on your faith, to get professional help, but most importantly, to decide that you want to get to a better place.
That's the key. Decide you want to get to a better place. And what's so interesting, we talk about this a number of times in our podcast, is that the very big difference between mental and physical health is that with physical health, oftentimes we're able to fix a situation. Leg snaps, breaks in half, put a cast on it, mends back together. It's good to go. You keep using it. But as you just said, grief is one of those things that it's just going to keep on showing up. And so you have to keep on healing it. And you use that word like to heal this. And I think what's important to say is this time around, like as it shows up, you keep throwing things at it because I like community, or I've got an opportunity or a purpose, or it's time to do something, like whatever that is for you. It's really important that you just throw something at it every time and you go, oh yeah, this is showing up again. Thanks. Right. Thanks for being here. Was having a great day till you showed up. And now I got to use my tools again. And I got to pull things out of my hat and get to work. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Dave, if you don't mind. And then Julianne, why don't you piggyback on his answer, which is, how did the people around you act and react in this time? And what could they have done differently? So Dave, I'll start with you. When it comes to grief, how can the community surrounding the grieving family be more helpful?
I can tell you different ways that it's gone down for people that I've seen. Sometimes family and friends don't know what to do, right? They don't want to say something wrong and make it worse. They don't want to compound your pain. Maybe they might have some thoughts about how you're handling your grief, maybe even a little judgy or critical about the way you're handling your grief. Maybe people feel awkward because they don't know if they can handle what you have to say. I mean, that's another piece of it too. So, I mean, there's a lot of different things that can make it complicated. What I would say to family and friends, if you know somebody that's going through this, is just be there. Call, get together. You don't necessarily have to talk about the loss, or be open to talking about it if your friend or family member wants to talk about it. Just be flexible and be whatever that person needs in the moment.
Yeah. You know what? And Julianne, I want you to answer that question too. And I want to say, just interject, when my mom died, what I witnessed from my sister and her group of friends and her community was nothing short of incredible. I mean, people just dropped off casseroles and, big baked lasagnas. People dropped off DoorDash gift certificates just so she wouldn't have to think about dinner and she could just get it done. People just came over and they took the dog out for a walk. People just came over and they took over and they just did what was necessary. And I just thought it was amazing. And I said to my sister several times over the 2 or 3 weeks that we were kind of really in the thick of it, of like, your friend group has impressed me more than you can possibly imagine. The things that they have done to help you, just the little things that they took off your plate, made such a huge difference. So Julianne, now it's your turn. So how did people handle it? What could they have done a little bit differently? Help us understand.
Well, it's like there's so much to unpack on this one, to be honest, because our social circle is so important in grief. So to both of your points, there is that initial place where everybody comes and they spend time with you or they bring you food, and that's amazing. What I encourage people to do is think about a month from now.
Yes.
3 months from now. So
yes.
If you know as someone. So first of all, think long-term. Yes, it's very important to be there at the time of the loss, but also think long-term, because everyone goes back to their life except the person who's lost, and they're sitting with it. And everybody's gone, and you have this whirlwind of activity, and then everybody's gone, and here you are all by yourself, and it's very lonely. The other thing is I because I was a young married person, I had a social circle of young married people. And when my husband died, guess what happened? I had no social circle of young married people anymore. So I stopped getting invited to every dinner party, every Christmas party, every whatever. And that's normal. So let me say, I'm not criticizing anyone, because they probably didn't know what to do with me. So the answer was, now I wouldn't have wanted to go and sit with a bunch of couples, to be honest. But when you start getting left out, you just feel as though you really are left out. You really are less than. And so I would also say, invite, if it's a situation, always invite. People can say no. I probably would have said no, but it would have really helped me feel more included if I would have been able to say no, instead that I was now in a different place and I felt really less valued. Oh, I'm not married anymore, so I have less value than everybody else who is married.
Interesting.
And
all of a sudden you're like the third wheel.
Yes. Yes. And you know what? You realize you're the third wheel, so you can accept that you're the third wheel, but just to be acknowledged, all you want is acknowledgement. Now, to your point about, I wrote a blog about what you should say and what you shouldn't say. And the problem is, in grief, is none of us know what to say, because it stinks. It sucks. It's hard. And there are no words. So if you can't think of something to say, just don't say anything. Just hug the person, just give them a big old hug. You don't have, you cannot fix, because when we're trying to think of what to say, what we're trying to do is fix for them.
Right. Or make ourselves feel better, right?
That's right. And that's okay too, because that's what we want to do. We want to help people. But if you don't know what to say, then just say nothing. Give them a hug. Or just say, this really sucks. I mean, you could really say it. This really sucks.
Yeah. Because
it does. And then I guess kind of the last thing that I would say on all of that is, and it's piggyback on that, is if you want to spend time with someone, just sitting there matters.
Yeah.
You don't have to say anything, but I love what your sister's friends did. And that's the other thing, is when you ask someone who is grieving, what can I do for you? They have no idea.
No idea.
Because now they got to process that.
That's right. It's like, I don't know. I can't go. So to go and say, like, can I come today? And I'm going to come today and walk your dog if that's okay. I'm going to come today and clean your house. I would like to come tomorrow morning and take your children to school so you don't have to do that. So having suggestions of things that you can do will take the load off that person. They're not going to likely be able to say, oh my gosh, wait, I need this and I need that, and I need this, because their brain is, I mean, you're in a fog. So I love the example that your sister's friends set for us to talk about today.
Me too. It was so impressive to watch. And I think, man, they could almost write the book on how to handle these things, because it doesn't make it any easier, right? But it does lighten the load a little bit, and it makes it feel like, okay, oh, I'm gonna get through this. Like it's tough right now, but I'm gonna get through this. As we start to wind down a little bit, Julianne, you mentioned a few minutes ago that there was a 19 years later and how different things look now. And so here we are recording on the anniversary of the week of him taking his own life 19 years ago. What is different? What have you noticed? What kind of shifts have taken place? And what kind of a place are you in now versus then?
So, like I said, it is such an ebb and flow. This year, for some reason, was hard. Maybe because my daughter got married this year. My son and his girlfriend are moving to handle things with a business over on the Central Coast, and there have been a lot of changes. So that may have been something that worked into it, is what's been happening. I will say that some days it feels like forever ago, and then some days it feels like yesterday. And that's the sneaky thing about grief, is you don't know which day you're going to get. Right. And things like, and you re-grieve so many things. So sometimes it's not even the anniversary of the day that somebody passed. It may be your wedding anniversary. It may be the day your child was born, if you've lost a child, or the year that you had in your mind that they would be getting married. So there's all of these things that enter into how you are doing today. And I would say today I'm content. I have two really beautiful children and a daughter-in-law, and hopefully soon another one. And, I am looking forward to grandbabies. There is life after loss. That doesn't mean I don't have really sad days. It doesn't mean I don't wish it was different, because I do. I very much wish it was different. It's been very hard watching my children grow up without their dad, grow up. And I think it is harder as a child, at least for mine, it's been harder. One thing for them to accept is, why didn't he love them enough to stay? And that's something that Dr. kind of alluded to as well. And so that's a tough thing to grow up with. And my daughter actually had a group of boys when she was growing up that teased her terribly, said terrible things. Or actually, even one of the boys said, you're essentially the reason that your dad killed himself. I didn't find out until she was 20, by the way, and that was in junior high. And what happened is one of the young men came over to apologize on her birthday. And so, what does life look like? I've had to negotiate situations that are the most pain that levels of pain I could have never thought I could get through. I will tell you that I had, about 5 months after my husband passed away, I almost drove myself and my children off a cliff. I was so despondent. I wanted to see where it was that he took his life. So I decided I was going to take a drive up there. And I thought, well, shoot, if I just drive us off the cliff, then none of us are sad anymore. They're not crying. I'm not crying. That actually was the turning point of me deciding I was going to make a life for myself. And, so I have a notion of what it might feel like to be in that dark of a place. And, the good thing is I haven't ever had that day again. But I've had to work to not have that day again. So what does it look like now? It looks like a life I didn't plan on. Some things in a way that I'm so sad are different. Other ways where I've had so many blessings that how could I not say that my life is wonderful? And it's hard because that actually doesn't diminish the loss of my husband. But I also think that people think that it does, right? So it's really quite an interesting life experience, for the lack of a better word. In some ways, I wouldn't change it, because some of the things that I've become, my kids have become, and what we've done. And look, here's the kitty cat. It wouldn't have happened if things were different. Again, I'd still take him back. But it's just such a fascinating, I kind of look back at my life and I'm kind of fascinated by all the things I've been through and how they've all worked together, and how I finally figured out that it's okay for me to have a life that is filled with joy.
That's so well said. And Dave, I'm going to give you the final word on this. It's so important to move on, to keep moving. Maybe that's a better way to say it, to keep moving and keep moving your life forward. I will tell you that one of the things after my dad died, so my dad died when my mom was 46, and so he was 47, so super young. And my mom never remarried. She never remarried. She actually had like only one really short fling, but other than that, she like never remarried. And I always kind of felt sad about that piece. Like I would have really wanted my mom to find another life partner that she could have hung out with for the next 20 years and done things with. And, it just would have made, I think, her life maybe different or better. And I don't know that she would say she's sad the way she handled it. I think she enjoyed her independence and enjoyed the way that she did things. And she led a widows group for 20 years. And I think that was her purpose. And that's how she kind of put herself out there to be of service. But Dave, let's talk about the psychology of moving on, because you can see where some people would get stuck on this idea where, like, if I keep moving, I'm not honoring them. And if I keep doing this, like, how did I really feel about that person? And that's not necessarily fair.
No, I mean, you have to keep moving forward. Getting stuck, that's not an option that's going to work out well. The idea of suicide too, when you had mentioned about thinking about driving off the cliff, I have kind of a weird take on suicide, or at least I think it's a little strange. Some people say, well, no, don't think about suicide. Don't ever even entertain the thought of it. I kind of go the other way with it, is if those thoughts are spontaneously coming up, think them all the way through. Think about the impact that it's going to have on your family. Think about the impact it's going to have on your children and the people around you. Think about the opportunities that you'll never get to experience because you decided to shorten your life. And as miserable as the situation is at the moment, things can always get better. You can move through and move on to a better place, but you'll never get to see that completion if you stop now and check out. So I think it's good to think that all the way through. And you said that in that moment you had that turning point. That's exactly the point that I'm making is, if you take some time to actually think about it and think about the impact, assuming that you're in a place where, the clinical depression is not so dark that you can't even see your way through it. Grief is a bit different than depression. A lot of times the biochemical component of a clinical depression, everything has a negative cast, and it's really hard or impossible to even see those possible positive outcomes to it. So that's a little bit different, but in a normal grieving process where the dark times are there, think it through and think about, where things could end up. And in some ways trust the process. If you come from a faith tradition, that's helpful because you know that God is going to open up opportunities for you and bring good things out of the grief. And you can't imagine what that's going to be. You just have to trust that it's going to come at one point.
Yeah. What a great conversation today. And I'm telling you that there's my major takeaway. It was something she said maybe 30 minutes ago, and you were talking about connection is key. And then you uttered the sentence, and it's your job. I wrote that down because to me, that's the most important piece of all self-care. And this is what I spend my life talking about now is people need to have better self-care strategies for themselves. And the number one thing is it's your job. It's called self-care. care. So you really have to elect into it. You have to be the one that decides you're ready for it, and the time is now. As we wrap up completely, the books are out right now. You can see Griefquake, Head Above Water. There's her daughter, You Can, You Will. And which one of those is a collection of stories? I know you worked on a collection of stories too, didn't you?
Yes, You Can, You Will is 18 women that collaborated with me to talk about loss and mental health. And so there are different experiences from each person that share, either situations where they've had to make decisions about their mental health, and or have experienced a terrible grief and how they've gotten through it. And so it's 19 different ways of looking at mental health and grief and seeing how somebody else was able to find the light.
Love it. I'll encourage everybody who's needing some assistance, who's ready to elect in, who's ready to, kind of take that opportunity and find their purpose and then execute their plan, to pick up the books and have a listen. And then I also want to just say really quick, Julianne's here today because somebody in our audience that listens to our podcast all of the time wrote to us, and she is somehow aware of you, Julianne. And she wrote to us saying what an incredible guest you would be. And she was on the money. Yeah, I just really enjoyed talking to you today, and I'm super happy that this woman, Crystal, suggested that we reach out to you and bring you on our podcast. Thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And Dr. Dave, I learned from you today as well, and I just appreciate all of the wisdom that you've brought in. And Matthew, I'm very sorry for the losses that you've been going through. I know it's a really tough time, and it's very courageous for you to take on this podcast with where you're sitting right now.
I think it's helpful for me. I mean, again, this is just me electing into it. I get to talk about it. I get to potentially learn some new tools. I get to think about things the way that I maybe hadn't before. So for me, where I used to maybe not want to, I would pull back a little bit. Now I find myself running to the fire a little bit more because I feel like that's where the warmth is, right? That's where, exactly. I just try to embrace it. And I certainly have my moments, but I'm just doing the best that I can. Dr. Dave, thank you. I agree, man. You are a freaking national treasure, and we would be lost without you, man. Thank you.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1, to help you feel less alone. 2, encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3, when you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Healthspan MD is a high-quality primary care and cardiology practice. That means expert, available with the best customer service in healthcare, combined with a proactive, whole-person approach to discover your best opportunities to take charge of your health. And we accept insurance. Get the healthcare that increases your health span by visiting healthspanmd.com.